All right, hi everybody. Today I want to talk to you about the equilibrium model for biogeography, and this model can be used to predict the number of species on habitat islands. Now, originally the model is developed for determining number of species on oceanic islands like this picture I showed you before, but it's applicable to conservation biology when we talk about our habitat islands that we mentioned before, with things like the formation of parks. And remember, there's two factors that are going to help determine the number of species on an island, and one of those is the immigration rate with an I. Immigration, remember, is the number of or the type of individuals coming in to a habitat, whereas immigration with an E is the number of things leaving. And the other factor determining number of species on the island is the extinction rate. And the extinction rate is local extinctions where a species is no longer on that island. And probably a better use of the term, often at least, is extirpated, because the animal probably or plant probably lives elsewhere, but it's no longer on that island. So the equilibrium point is influenced by the two factors, which is the size of the island and the distance of the island from the mainland, assuming that that's where the species that occupy the island are originally going to come from. So you might know about a little tiny island like Santa Barbara Island, and then the distance from the island to the mainland, for example, and you might notice Santa Cruz Island in this picture here. And the distance of that from the mainland of Southern California. And you might notice a place like San Nicolas Island, which you probably have not heard too much about. And my father, who was an electrical engineer who worked for the government on different engineering projects related to Homeland Security, would occasionally go out to San Nicolas Island. Apparently he's pretty famous out there. So if you're ever out on San Nicolas Island, drop my last name, Ravel, and maybe someone will pay attention, but maybe not. And these represent the Channel Islands, which are right off our coast here in Southern California. Probably the most famous of that group of islands is the Catalina Island, which a lot of people go for tourist events and things like that. There you go. So this graph shows you the relationship between the immigration rate, represented here with the letter I, and the number of species on an island. So notice the point on the graph here, the immigration rate in the beginning is very, very high. As the number of different species on the island increases, the immigration rate goes down because the habitat is being used up by the organisms that are already there. So the immigration rate becomes zero at P, which represents the pool of possible species that could get from the mainland onto your island, meaning that the island becomes saturated or filled with the possible species once they've reached the island. So I'm going to give you an example. So assume on the mainland you have a possible number of species, say 100 birds, that could occupy your island, and right now there's no species of birds on a particular island. It's empty. So over time, the pool of possibilities starts out with 100, but as one bird species occupies the island and then another and then another, the number of species that could occupy it is declining because you already have 3 or 4 or 5 on it. So at some point, when you have, let's say, 20 different bird species now on the island, that means the possibilities from your original pool are now down to 80, as an example. This graph shows the extinction rate and the number of species on the island. So notice down here, when there are 0 species on the island, there are 0 extinctions, because nothing can go extinct if there's nothing already on it. So the reason, in part, the extinction rate is going to increase on the island as there are more species is because we move closer and closer to what's called carrying capacity, which you might remember carrying capacity is the number of individuals that can be supported by the environment in a particular habitat, usually related to food and shelter and things of that sort. All right, so if you look at this graph where you have extinction and immigration, the point where the immigration rate equals the extinction rate, right here where the two lines cross, in this model, this is the equilibrium number of species for that particular island. And that's represented by what I have down here. We call it an S hat. It's an S with a little green cap over it. That's the equilibrium number of species on the island. Let's compare an island that is a small island and another one that is a large island. And what we're going to find is the number of species that arrive on the large island, all things else being the same, is going to be greater than that for the small island, because a larger island is basically in part a bigger target for one, and the equilibrium number of species on a large island is going to be higher than for a small island, because remember the species area curve we talked about before, where we plot the number of species as a function of area. So remember, as you have a larger area, increases the number of species because of two important reasons we mentioned before. One is you tend to have more habitat diversity when you have a bigger area, and the other thing is you tend to have larger population sizes, and remember, larger population sizes tend to be more stable and less likely to go extinct. So we can look at the immigration rate on islands that would be near the mainland and compare those to islands that are, say, far away. And again, if we use the mainland as our source of our species, we're going to get to the island that is closer. The immigration rate for an island that is close to the mainland tends to be higher than an immigration rate for an island that is distant from the mainland, because it's going to be easier to get to the island that is closer. Again, assuming all other components are the same, if the habitat is the same in both of those scenarios. And so now we can graph that relationship between immigration rate and distance from, say, the mainland. In this particular islands that are closer, species tend to be able to get to them easier because there's less of a distance for them to travel, all things being considered, whereas an island that's much further away, the immigration rate tends to be lower in scenarios like that. So again, we can look at the immigration rate for small and large islands, and a small island it's a smaller target. It's harder to land on that particular target. And a larger island ends up being a larger target. So once again, you expect large islands tend to have higher immigration rates than small islands. And the other thing we can do is we can look at the extinction rate as a function of island size. Smaller islands tend to have higher extinction rates than larger islands because, once again, you have less habitat spaces usually, and you tend to have smaller population sizes, which we've already discussed those items before. So now you can put the whole thing together and you can ask yourself, okay, what about small islands that are close versus small islands that are far, and large islands that are close versus large islands that are far? And you can put that all together in trying to predict what you would end up with. All right, so we can combine all those graphs into one super awesome graph that looks like this, that compares immigration and extinction rates for small and large islands that are both near and distant to the mainland. And what you find is this represents the equilibrium number of species. So if you look, islands that are far and small when compared to our islands that are near and large, islands that are near and large have a much higher equilibrium number of species than islands that are far and small in size, which is logically what you would predict. So, what are the predictions of the model? Well, once equilibrium is reached, the number of species will tend to remain fairly constant over time. The species composition is changing, and this is called a turnover rate. And the turnover rate is inversely proportional to the area of the island. So, small islands tend to have a much higher turnover rate, and large islands tend to be more stable and have a lower turnover rate. Okay, so let's think about this. And what I want you to do in a second here, I'm going to have you hit the pause button, have a look at Santa Barbara Island and compare it to Santa Cruz Island. So, and which of those islands would you expect to have a higher equilibrium number of species? So I'm going to have you hit the pause button now and see if you can come up with the answer. And then I'm going to talk about that. So hit pause, think about it a little bit. All right. Now that you've hopefully hit pause and restarted and had a chance to think about it, let's look at some real data here. And you can see Santa Barbara Island, and you can see Santa Cruz Island, and Santa Barbara Island compared to Santa Cruz is a small distant island. Santa Cruz is a large near island, and if we look at the actual data for the number of bird species, Santa Barbara Island has 6 bird species and Santa Cruz Island has 37 species. And so Santa Cruz has 37 species of birds, so the distant small island with 6 species has significantly less birds than Santa Cruz, which is a near large island.